Welcome to another presentation where we're looking at education as it moves forward into the future. We're looking at evidence from research, quality worldwide research, evidence that can help us to plan for the future. We now reach presentation 7, and we're going to look at what research reveals about quality in education. Yes, quality is a big bandwagon idea today, and we all want it. Education is under enormous pressure worldwide. Most of those who are working within the education system in some way are striving for it. But there's a fundamental question. What is it? And how do we assess it? We have a strange paradox in this area. These authors have summarized it beautifully. It has a slippery meaning. You never seem to be able to get a grip on it. But it raises that fundamental question. There is no agreement. And if we're not agreed about what quality means when it comes to education, how can we possibly measure it? In many areas of life, it's easy to define and describe quality. But when it comes to education, it certainly has a slippery meaning. And yet, if we've been taught by a great teacher, we know it. We appreciate it. But can we agree what are the characteristics of the great teacher? Not even that is possible. Because a teacher who's great for one learner may not be quite as great for another. So can you think of quality as fitness for purpose? Education's doing what it's intended to do. But what is the purpose of education? There is no agreement. And anyway, who decides? And can these purposes be possibly accessible? It's a slippery concept. At the end of the day, who decides that we've fulfilled the desired educational purposes? That doesn't take us forward very much either. Now let's turn to research. Fortunately, there is a large quantity of worldwide research that has looked at issues related to quality. And the first one is that devastating statement. School inspections are highly unreliable and often totally invalid. We'll look at that further and show why that has to be so. But the evidence is very clear-cut. And looking at examination performance, the evidence shows that this reveals almost nothing about quality. And we'll look at that in more detail and see what the research evidence reveals. Now, these are the most common two things that people do or look at. They don't work. If you look at what students say, and there are many studies that have looked at this with different language, different perspectives, different cultures, different settings, here are two sets of approaches. The learners like it when the students know what they're talking about and they're committed to it. So a field of knowledge, an area of study, that's important. It's no use asking a biologist to teach physics and be committed to physics just because they're called a scientist. Equally, There's no point in asking a physicist to teach biology and be committed to it. It's the height of lunacy, and the evidence supports that. But how about that one? That comes out very clearly. The learners really like it when they think the teachers are on their side, working with them, understand them, have empathy. Now, where is empathy in our selection procedures for becoming a teacher? And learners like it when they see the value and purpose in what they're doing. Now, we need to expose a lot of things that go on in schools and ask, are these really necessary? Are they important? Is this what the learners really need? Here's another little look at it from a different perspective. Students like it when they feel their teachers are passionate about what they taught. Very similar to the previous analysis. They like it when they see in learners things that others didn't see. They can see possibilities, potentials, abilities. And they encourage learners, and they provide the opportunities to move forward, progress. These are all very much related to the learner and the relationships between teachers and learners. But notice, passionate about what they've taught. Subjects do matter. People have looked at this phrase, educational standards. But what do we mean by that? And who decides the standards anyway? People have looked at student potential. And I'm drawing from the remarkable work of Khalid Al-Madani. He looked at this amongst many other things, looking at the student. You can look at things at an individual level and ask the question, to what extent has the individual student potential been released? Every human being we might describe as a bundle of potential. Education is the task of releasing that potential, not straitjacketing it, not pushing it down one direction, but releasing it. But there's wider society. We live in wider society. Are we equipping our individual students for life ahead, life beyond education? Perhaps they're going to go on into further study, but in fact all life involves further study and development. Are we equipping them for that? And are we equipping our individual learners so that they can contribute to society, not just in the workplace, but in wider society, bringing benefit to others? Now, you ponder these things, and it's a very deep analysis. How on earth do you judge that? We're in no position to look inside the individual learner and see what the potential is. But if you look at the other three, you're only going to get the evidence if you wait a decade or two and ask, did it equip them for life? Did it help them in further study and development? Were they able to make a contribution to society? You can't judge that by looking at a school or a university. Back to student potential. A very strong stress in this work is that we're now looking at the learner. Education is there for the benefit of learners. And sometimes we lose that focus. But it raises two questions. Has the educational journey of our students developed the kind of learner we're seeking? And how do we describe and define that? And has the process that they've been through been acceptable to them and wider society? These are very deep questions that do not have easy answers. Let's come back to this picture here. We're looking at quality but the focus has to be on the learner. Let's think of our learner. They go through a process that we call education. Out at the far end of the process, perhaps at the end of the school term or end of a degree, out comes a product. We can look at process, we can look at product. So that's the kind of school education timeline if we just restrict it to schools for the moment. Now, can we look at the process through which they've gone, and can we measure this in any way that's meaningful or objective? Or are we all going to come to this with our own biases and preconceptions? But what about the product? Do we actually agree what is the desirable product? What is our ideal student when they leave school? That's not easy to do because we vary so much. And what's desirable for one student may not be so desirable for the next. Let's look at these just a little bit further. Now, if we look at the process, here are just 5 things that people can look at to help us look at the process. We can look at the teacher qualifications. The teachers know what they're doing. Are they competent? We can look at their classroom performance. We can look at the skills and commitments of the teachers and the education system as a whole. We can look at the resources that have been made available to schools. We can look at the exam performance that come out of the classroom. We can look at the product at the end of the day. Here's 5 suggestions. We can look at the academic performance. We can look at whether they're employable. Are they equipped for full citizenship? Have we generated lifelong learners? But even more interesting, have we created or encouraged or supported the development of a quality individual? And what on earth do we mean by that? Because different societies and cultures may have different pictures. Now, the tragedy is this. What education worldwide is doing at the moment is it's just wiping off the various aspects of process and looking at the classroom. So we have an inspection system, ignoring all the other things. And we wipe all the other things at the end, and we look at how well did they do in their exams. Now that's the way education quality is being looked at the moment, and it is ignoring things, large number of things, which may be far, far more important. We are distorting education by our looking at quality in this way. These are the 2 things that tragically we're focusing on at the moment. Now, what research shows is that academic performance, that's how well you do in your exams, is strongly influenced by home and societal influences. The school doesn't control them. The innate abilities in the background of our learners. The school doesn't control them. The types of curricula and assessment systems that have been set up in various nation states or provinces. The school doesn't control them. In other words, judging a school by its academic performance, the key things, the most important things that influence that performance are not within the control of the school. The whole argument is totally flawed. And that's coming from research evidence that's been confirmed again and again and again. But what about classroom performance? What does research show about that? Soon as someone enters a classroom or a teaching area to observe things, what they observe is altered. That has to be so. It is always so, no matter how hard the observer tries to just fade into the background. You're not seeing reality. And what you're seeing is totally artificial because the situation is set up to be artificial. Again and again we get stories and pictures and evidence that shows that teachers, often with the collusion of their students, are setting up a lesson designed to impress. And the observer is deluded, conned. You see, one visit may be totally atypical. A good class, a bad class, a good day, a bad day, difficult topic, easy topic. And tragically, the observers often lack credibility. The only people who are competent to judge how a teacher is doing are those who are practicing teachers, who live in the reality of the real world of teaching. Outsiders, and as they drift away from practice, increasingly lack credibility. So we have a problem here. So why focus on these things? It's totally an invalid and unreliable way to judge quality in schools, and yet, in most countries, in varying degrees, we do it. And then we criticise the teachers, the head teachers, or the schools. It is destroying and undermining all that is good in education. Let's remember this. This is simply facts. The teachers in any classroom in any country, they don't decide the curriculum they have to teach. It's laid down for them. They don't decide the examinations the students have to sit. Outside bodies decide that. They don't decide the resources available to them to enable them to teach, and some countries are much better resourced than others. They don't decide the kind of training that they've gone through to prepare them to be a teacher. They don't decide the ongoing training and support that's available to them during their teaching. And they don't even decide which students they're asked to teach. They're just given a class. Why blame teachers for things where they've got no control? Now, the net effect of doing this is you end up with disillusioned teachers. And the net result of that is that they start to look for jobs outside teaching. And schools that have gone down the line of focusing on classroom performance and exam results are the countries where there is a shortage of teachers. Look at the evidence. Now, we've got a real danger in all of this. The danger is we're looking at educational systems. That's the way we should be looking. We should be looking at what benefits the learner, not what we think benefits the learner, but what the evidence shows benefits the learner. And the best placed person to judge that is often the teacher. That's the tragedy. Quality is difficult, and we need to rethink it totally. We all want it, but where's the agreed description? But why try to measure it? We've got to ask that question. Why is there all these continual attempts to try to measure quality? Some countries have done it in all sorts of public service, and there's been an enormous backlash. And the net effect is that quality deteriorates. The very measurement may be destructive. Now, there's a more fundamental question. Are the learners gaining the best they can from their educational journey? Now, that gives us a kind of beginning of a handle on what we mean by quality, but it still leaves it fairly vague. because we don't know what we mean by the word best. But it's best for them. Not best for our systems, not best for what we think. Not best from what politicians or educationists think. It's best for what the learners actually need. The problem is we've looked at quality assurance from two perspectives: accountability and improvement. So we've asked that question. Education is expensive. Are the resources given being utilised the best for every learner? A quite legitimate question to ask. And every society must look at it. Although the way we're looking at it at the moment in most countries is utterly flawed. But there's something that's more important. We're looking for learners to gain a better experience. Ever increasingly better. Now the problem is that quality assurance in countries has never resolved the accountability improvement dilemma. Which way are we going? And if we really want to get at it, we've got to focus on the learner, not the systems. The learner, not the teachers. The learner, not the exam results, because that only reflects a small range of outputs, largely controlled by things beyond the school's control. Let's focus on the learner as a human being, as a bundle of potential moving out into the world to make a positive contribution. But too often, quality assurance has focused on accountability and neglected improvement. Now, I'm being oversimplifying this slightly at the moment, but I'm going to look at 3 models for quality assurance in schools. And broad brush terms, these reflect what's going on in most countries of the world today. We've got the kind of inspection model, where outsiders come and observe what's going on in schools, pass judgment, and we think that generates quality. The evidence shows it doesn't. We've got the attainment model, where we look at the outputs in terms of exam marks, and then we criticise schools on the basis of these. Or do we compare schools, or even compare countries? This one is named after Charlotte Dannielsen. She never called it her own model, but there's extensive writing, and it offers a different way of looking at things, and the evidence shows that this way holds potential for the future. So let's just look at these 3 models. The inspection model. Now this is just a broad brush overall picture. It varies slightly from country to country. The description. 1 or more outsiders visit a school. They look at the overall provision. They make visits to lessons delivered by individual teachers or a sample of teachers, say across departments. Now it has the appearance of objectivity. But it doesn't have any objectivity at all, in fact, because the outsiders come in with an agenda, often imposed from their organisation or politically. The negative features are that very often the agenda the outsiders, the inspectors, have isn't known to the schools. And there's little credibility. Teachers resent being judged by people who are not practicing teachers. They've lost the sense of reality. The actual lesson observed is highly artificial. The comments made are often highly negative. And very often the outsiders demand improvements which are contradicted by the evidence. And you've got to be a very confident teacher just to ignore that and do what you know is best for your own students. Particularly if the inspectors are given draconian powers. The evidence shows, not an opinion, the evidence shows the approach is totally invalid. It passes critical comments but doesn't offer the support. It's got this accountability without the improvement element. But the most damaging thing is it can undermine, and that's an understatement, it can even destroy. There are even cases where teachers have been driven to suicide. Morale goes, and teachers start to look over their shoulders for an alternative career. And countries with draconian inspection approaches are losing their teachers. The evidence is clear. So let's look at the attainment model. Sounds so good. You look at the examination data in one or more subjects, or overall. They're collated. And then the outcomes are compared to those generated by other schools or countries. Some countries force schools to publish their exam data for their last year. Totally flawed concept. Now, it looks quite precise, and you can make easy mathematical comparisons. The problem is exam data reflect only one tiny fragment of what a school's there to do. Schools there are to educate, prepare people for life, not to train them in test passing. So it distorts the whole of education, and teachers then end up focusing on what will get better results, neglecting things that may be very much more important. But there's that really powerful thing, which is strongly supported by evidence. The exam performance in a school is known to be very poorly related to teaching quality or school quality, simply because there are other factors that control exam performance that are far more dominant. And the evidence is consistent. It's invalid. Totally invalid. The trouble is, because it looks quantitative, you can generate highly critical and ill-informed media political comment, and the net effect is teachers who are trying to do their best for their students, they're undermined. And countries that have gone down this line strongly have the same effect. They lose their teachers. Quality teachers are rare. We need to keep every single one. How about the Dannielsen model? We'll get references at the end. I'm giving you the principles of the model. The way to work it through has to be translated into a given education system and culture. Teachers, all of them, are trained as both evaluators and to be evaluated. But there's a common, professionally agreed agenda. Now, it's found to work. The only people who can judge quality of teaching are those who are teachers, but training is needed. You see, that's the great positive feature. But the approach is positive and affirming, not negative and critical. So we're looking for improvement, not accountability. And then it can be tied into where resources are brought to bear and support is offered. The whole thing is integrated together to bring greater and increasing benefit to future learners. Now, it doesn't enjoy political media support, but it allows a profession to be treated as a profession without ill-informed outside interference. Now, some countries have gone part of the way down that line. The evidence shows that teachers overall as a profession are generally highly committed to their students. We're not suggesting all teachers are perfect. No profession has all its participants as perfect, but highly committed. So it generates a positive, supportive atmosphere which encourages increasing quality. The evidence is out there. You could summarize it by that. I am trained to evaluate I shall be evaluated by those trained to evaluate, who've got credibility because they're practicing teachers. It's worth pondering this. Look at the medical professions. I just pick up doctors and dentists. They would not tolerate being judged by someone who is not a practitioner, someone with little credibility, an outsider. And if you've moved out of a profession for a year or two, you start to lose credibility very quickly. It's inevitable. No doctor or dentist would tolerate being judged against criteria that were not based on research and clinical practice. And the tragedy with education is research evidence is ignored. And inspection systems are very, very bad at that. No doctor or dentist would tolerate being criticised or condemned by those who have never done the job. I've seen head teachers criticised by visiting inspectors, none of whom has ever been a head teacher, ever. If we want a teaching profession to be a profession, and if we want quality, we must treat it as a profession. We've got to look at things differently. And we can learn an awful lot from what goes on in medicine. And medicine has made enormous advances over the last decades and century or two. Looking at it at a worldwide level, and again as a reference that has done this, but I'm just going to pick up a few broad general trends from that. This quality agenda has driven endless programs of so-called reform, which is just some outsider's bright idea usually. And there's no evidence looking back that any of these have brought any improvements. That's a savage comment, but it's true. The evidence shows it. And the one thing we human beings can't cope with is endless change. And there are some teaching professions and countries have been studied in this where the teachers are just faced with endless change year after year after year based on this pseudo-quality agenda, and you end up with a profession that doesn't know where it's going. Not trusted. And that's what you end up with. And that's happening worldwide. In many countries you can see that very clearly. And it's seen in one or two Western countries very clearly. In some countries, the sheer pressure for exam success has caused a growth of coaching industries. Some are done by the schools within the schools, so the youngsters stay on into the evenings, late afternoons for extra tuition. Some cases the parents pay for it with private tutors and private classes in the evenings. It blights the lives of young people who should be given the opportunity just to be young people and enjoy and learn from life. Some areas suicide rates are a bit frightening. And that's what it's doing. We're not improving education. We're close to destroying it. If I look at two extremes just for the moment, we've got the countries with regular school inspections. They insist on publishing examination results and they're involved in international testing. At the other extreme, and I think of one particular country that I won't name, but it's all over the literature, teachers are trained to a high level. There is no inspectorate at all. There are no league tables of examination results, no comparisons. And teachers are treated as professionals, expected to deliver, and they do, in general, deliver extremely well. That's the two extremes. And I could put example countries in them, but I don't wish to do that at this stage. What the evidence shows is doing that gets high standards, and teaching is regarded as a high status profession, and there's competition to get into it. So there's selection of the best. Don't our young people deserve the best? That cons us with pseudo-high standards. You get ever-increasing exam results, and in the process education is being destroyed. And the evidence shows very clearly. The profession has got low status, and there's a shortage of teachers. Which way do we want to go? Let's just for the moment look at international testing, which is a modern bandwagon. It's had a huge impact on education worldwide. Let's just look at two directions. Education used to be thought of as a cultural system. Not particularly good description, but it does cover it. Something like that. School education was designed to enable learners to make sense of themselves, their culture, and their potential role in that culture, to prepare them for life. What international testing has done is it's moved it that way. It's undermined that and created that. The goal is to steer learners into skills, understandings, and so-called problem-solving capacity, which is rarely understood, designed for the benefit of future national developments in that country. That's what it's done. And basically it's destroying the cultural nature of education. That whole line is totally flawed, and there is endless research evidence, reviews, books that shows that whole way is flawed. We've got to rethink things enormously. You see, international testing ignores the evidence from international research. A few years ago, I happened to, for another task, to have to look at all the international research I could lay my hands on, and with one of the best libraries in the world, I think I've probably got it all. I could find no study anywhere that supported international testing, and endless studies that showed the terrible effects it was having on education. The organizations who run international testing just ignore it. It imposes a kind of standardization on the curricula. Inevitably it has to. People teach to the test. And the process, it's narrowing the curricula, and it's narrowing the range of skills rewarded, because there's a limit to what you can reward in a written paper that's designed in one language but to cover many different cultures. You've got an extensive monitoring system set up. The cost is simply eye-watering. And standards are seen that way. Education is far, far more than subject-based competencies. It just ignores teacher expertise. It ignores the whole concept of teacher empathy, which the learners say is so important. Cultural features get sidelined. We're all being standardized into an international system. But it's driving things forward on the basis of a flawed political economic agenda. And there's major research shows it's flawed. If you look at the test materials, and research done on that, highly questionable validity. And it assumes test outcomes reflect educational quality. Where is the evidence? There's loads of evidence that contradicts it. And it distorts the wider educational goals. Because what can't be tested in a written test no longer has value. Teachers are being forced to teach to the test. Teachers want something better. What it's doing is it's generating disillusionment. The evidence is very strong, and the quality is actually deteriorating. is doing major damage. The sooner we get rid of it, the better. I just pick up 3 quotations here. Major work. Student test performance is strongly associated with variables that are beyond the control of teachers and schools. That summarizes what the evidence says consistently. Donald T. Campbell, a former president of the American Psychological Association, an eminent academic in his own right, said this, which has been enshrined later as Campbell's law. It's worth thinking about what he says. Very deep, very perceptive. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. Just put in international exam marks, test marks, put in education and the planning of education. That, the evidence to support that in education, there are numerous studies have shown that's true. Eminent emeritus professor of education. What was once educationally significant but difficult to measure has been replaced by what is insignificant and easy to measure. So now we test how well we have taught what we do not value. And there's many a teacher would echo that, forced to teach to the test things that they know are not the best for the benefit of their students. These summarize, but the evidence is overwhelming, both with regard to inspections and with regard to testing. We've got to take it seriously. That's my comment, and that's based on evidence. Here are 3 that I think are sound aims of education derived from many sources. The potential of all learners to be developed and fulfilled. Equipping all learners to play a full part in modern society and culture. Equipping all learners to be able to make a contribution to their own society in terms of bringing benefit to others. Now, I think that captures what is written all over the place as 3 very, very central and positive. One focuses on the individual, and the other 2 focus on preparing the individual to function in society, and then preparing the individual to give to society. Doesn't include test passing. Doesn't include examination, inspections of schools. You see, the whole testing regime, national or international, it's all based on accountability, and it distorts all of that, and you lose these great sound goals for education. You can see the disaster. It's arrived in some countries in varying degrees. It's increasing. It's being imposed from outside. Our future young people are going to be damaged. The way ahead? Well, this is based on evidence, not my opinions, evidence. Treat teachers as professionals. But we've got to look critically at their whole teacher education at the beginning and the ongoing support. We're going to look at that in the next presentation. Treat people as professionals, expect them to deliver, and on most occasions they will deliver, and they will deliver beyond even our expectations. And allow the profession to monitor the profession. Now, there are beginnings of that in my own country with the General Teaching Council for Scotland. but it could be made much wider in other fields. Get the research back at the centre. We're taking decisions that are based on opinions with people who've got agendas. And let's get the resources right. Things are being wasted. And schools need the resources in the schools, what the teachers actually need. And they and the head teachers are best placed to decide that. And get systems that are not competing with each other. The evidence shows that comprehensive schools, unified together, working together, not competing, gives you better outcomes. Stop the comparisons. It's all negative. Damages people. Inspection systems, that's not the inspectors themselves, they may be doing the best they can. The systems, they're invalid. And they generate outcomes that are harmful. Get the learner back at the centre. Now there's some positive things on agenda for quality for the way ahead. And if we followed that agenda, then we were able to, in any country, in any context, in any situation, to lift an education system forward into the future. Now, I've drawn from a lot of research, and there is a lot of research, and it's not possible to show it on screen. I've put up a very narrow selection, but again I'm going to refer to a book which has got a much wider range in its references. The work of Khalid Al-Madani there in the top two, because he looked at it in the secondary context worldwide overall, it brings together a lot of the evidence in useful ways. The work of Dannielsen, I've just picked up one book. It's pointed the way to a much better way forward. And then there are very famous people that are quoted further down who've based a lot of their work on experience and evidence. And they show that the current systems are not working. Goldstein, Gordon, Horn and his team, Ingvarsson, Meyer, Nichols, Popham, Ravitch, Stobbart and Wolf. Eminent people with their colleagues. For simplicity, I've only named the first author. And they have offered wonderful insights, rigorous insights into aspects of the assessment and evaluation which leads to quality. And they can direct us and lead us forward into the future. But that's just a selection. If you look at 2 chapters of this book, there's a much wider range of references offered. Tracking these through will give you even more information, but it does give a very consistent picture, and in many countries that is being ignored, tragically. Another tough educational journey. I think we would agree that teachers are central. But what about training and equipping? We'll look at that in the next presentation as we move on in looking at education and the research evidence that can help us.